Let's talk developments in Syria. I'm joined by my guest, Daniel Surwer in Washington. He is a professor at the School of Advanced International Studies and a scholar at the Middle East Institute. Also in Washington, we have Richard Rubenstein. He is an author and a university professor of conflict resolution and public affairs at George Mason University. And in Berlin, we cross to Christoph Horstel. He is a government consultant and publicist. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Richard, if I go to you first in Washington, you know, coming out of the Geneva conference there, it looked like it was a planned failure because no one was on the same page. The U.S. went there demanding regime change, and the Assad people said, hey, we showed up. Who are we going to talk to? There was no one to talk to. This was a planned failure.
Well, I don't know if I would call it a planned failure, but I think it was fated to fail. Because it was so focused on issues of power, which we knew the parties disagreed about. The United States may have wanted regime change. Russia wanted the rebels to be called terrorists, or certainly Assad regime did. And that sort of rhetoric and that sort of negotiation, which in some ways you could call it traditional negotiation, a traditional power-based diplomacy, is not the same as conflict resolution. Conflict resolution means getting representatives of the key groups in Syrian civil society together, not necessarily the political leaders, although they may be included, and getting them to talk about the real problems of the Syrian people, the sorts of things that caused the civil war to begin with. Those problems were never surfaced, never talked about, never even mentioned in these, so far as I know, in these diplomatic negotiations. I mean, we're talking about things like the relationship between the religious minority and minority in Syria. We're talking about things like who controls the oil revenues and what kind of development they should be used for. We're talking about things like who should Syria's allies be. The kind of essential questions that pose questions I would call social constitutional issues. There has to be a forum for dealing with these social constitutional issues, because the whole thing
shouldn't be the most important. The most important thing is to end the violence. Daniel, if I can go to you in Washington, I mean, you know, irrespective of the players involved, shouldn't be the primary goal of all of this to end the violence, end the death, and then worry about what kind of government is going to be in Damascus and what the people are going to choose in some kind of democratic process? Isn't that more important to end the conflict?
Well, but the conflict isn't going to end as long as Bashar al-Assad is in power, and that's quite clear. So if you want to end the violence, you've got to prepare for a political transition. There's no question about that.
Okay, Christoph, I mean, I don't understand.
Yeah,
I think, isn't it better to end the conflict here than to worry about political personalities? Go ahead, in Berlin.
Well, it's clear we have to agree on certain facts, and the fact is that the Syria operation took 3 years to stage. Of course, you know, there was a good reason for the opposition to demonstrate against Assad. Unequal, distribution of goods and chances for career and life and things like that. That's very clear. But we have such a clear-cut interference from the outside with more than 100,000 mercenaries, and even American Secret Service Director Mr. Klepper agreed to 26,000, very radical Sunni fighters there on the ground who, in fact, behave like terrorists. They're turning Syria into rubble. We have 6-7 million refugees internally and externally outside the country, both. So what are we talking about? If we insist, or if the West insists, if the American-led West insists on a regime change, what's that? And they say, unless we have a regime change, this kind of warfare will continue. This is a kind of NATO mafia group insisting on regime change in a country where they have no say whatsoever, not according to the UN Charter and any legal right worldwide.
Okay, Daniel, how do you?
It has nothing to do
Go
with
ahead,
NATO
Daniel, jump in.
insisting on regime change. It's the Syrians who are insisting on regime change, not the Americans. There are no 100,000 mercenaries in Syria. This is nonsense.
So
the destruction is being caused principally by the forces of the regime
Assad.
and not the rebels.
Christoph, you want to react to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, of course, that's completely wrong. It was the CIA in an assessment which said that Assad has the majority of the Syrian people behind him, and that's fact. That's fact. And a lot of Western experts here in Europe, at least, they say very clearly, without Assad, Syria doesn't stand a chance to, overcome the terrible results of this terrible proxy warfare in Syria.
Okay, Richard,
I'd like to read that assessment. You'll have to send me a reference to it.
I'd like to have equal time for everyone on this program. So, Richard, if I can go to you. All during these talks here, we know it's a fact. It's a fact that the U.S. has been funding what rebel groups it likes. I mean, they call them moderates. I still don't know who they are. And the Saudis are pouring in all kinds of military hardware. I mean, you're sitting in Geneva trying to find a peaceful resolution, and you have all of this money, all of this equipment, guns and violence going into the country. Well, how can you talk about peace when there are outside parties fueling it on?
Well, two answers to that, or two comments. One is that, yes, there are certainly proxy elements, important proxy elements of this conflict. You have the United States on one side and the Saudis, and you have Russia on the other side and the Iranians. So, I mean, you have proxies right to the right and proxies to the left. But proxy warfare, you can't simply say, let's stop doing the proxy warfare. That's just talking into the wind. You can't simply say, let's have peace. That's talking into the wind. The way you get to peace is you don't wait for necessarily for a ceasefire or even for the end of proxy warfare. You start the talks right now. Brahimi leaves, and he says he's sorry, he didn't do it a good job. Well, given the kind of job that he was trying to do, I think it was impossible. Now that he's talking about starting again, either he or somebody else starting again, there are many, many facilitators, very talented people, skilled people, people who know that region, who are able right now to be conducting talks between key groups inside Syria. So that's what should happen, in my view, and it should happen immediately.
Okay.
There, in fact, are some plans, I'm told, for a conference in Vienna in a little while where some of this discussion is going to be happening. But unless you get the groups together who are the most directly alienated, unless you get the groups together who have really created this civil war inside Syria, it doesn't do any good to bemoan the fact that it's become a proxy war, or to bemoan the fact that...
Let me go back to Daniel. I mean, it seems to me that this conference was talking in the wind because the players on the ground that are committing violence in the opposition, they don't have any interest in peace talks whatsoever. They just want more Saudi equipment and American money. By the way, a lot of them commit human rights atrocities as well. The West likes to focus all of its attention on Assad, but the rebels are committing atrocious activities against civilian populations that don't even want them there. And as Christoph pointed out, a lot of them are foreigners, not even Syrians. Go ahead, Daniel.
I recommend you read the United Nations report on the human rights abuses in Syria. It's very clear that the bulk of the abuses are on the part of the regime. It's very clear that the bulk of the foreign fighters and the bulk of the finance and arming is going to the regime as well. Russia is very much implicated in supporting a regime that is systematically destroying the centers of major cities in Syria. This is an embarrassment for Russia, and it will have repercussions.
The Assad regime is still the legitimate regime of the Syrian people. It is internationally recognized as so. Sending weapons to terrorist groups is illegal under international law, but sovereign countries can do that. Christoph, go ahead.
I know nothing in international law that prohibits arms trade.
What we see here is very clearly a reason why the talks in Geneva cannot be successful. if we cannot acknowledge that the proxy war in Syria was prepared from 2 years ago, if we cannot acknowledge that the armed rebel forces, be they foreign terrorists or whatever, are not allowed for compromise because they will lose their funding and their weapons and things like that. If we cannot acknowledge that for a solution we have to have on the table at least Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and the US. And without this, you know, the poor Syrians, they can talk their head off and they won't get anywhere. Look at the group present in Geneva in the past. That was left by their armed forces, and they became powerless on the ground in Syria due to this. And now the armed opposition is planning to do their own group and then try to be represented in Geneva. And that's talking between the Assad government and foreign-paid foreign proxies. And that's completely a perverted game. We have a huge breach of any law on the UN Charter and anything here. And what are we talking about between two Americans and a German? That's terrible. This discussion is terrible. Sorry.
Okay, well, we're going to go, on that note, we're going to go to a short break, gentlemen. After that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent developments in Syria. Okay, Richard, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. It looks, if you read the tea leaves here, or read between the lines, the Obama administration is going to consider using military force again, like we saw back in August here. Do you see that as a possibility right now? Because it seems like the Americans have really no interest in diplomacy here whatsoever. It went through the motions. Like I said, money and weapons keep pouring into the battlefield where civilians are trying to live. Most of them are moving away, trying to escape. It looks like, you know, war is on the agenda again for the United States and its allies, most likely.
Well, it's certainly there's certainly a possibility of U.S. intervention. I mean, I think the calculus of interest still weighs against it, but there's a possibility because I think what we really need over there are three peace processes. We need talks going forward simultaneously on three issues. One is the humanitarian crisis in Syria. If the U.S. intervenes, it's going to be because, or at least allegedly because, of a humanitarian crisis. The New York Times this morning and other newspapers have been playing up more and more the suffering in Aleppo and Homs and other places. So something has got to be done to open the door to relieving the suffering of the Syrian people. But of course, you can't separate that from the war itself and from the politics of the situation. So simultaneously, it seems to me, you do need something like along the lines that Christoph was talking about, that is to say a multi-party, a conference that involves all the major parties, including the proxies. That would certainly include Iran as well as the Saudis and the United States and the Russians. But you must have, and most important, a constitutional process in which the groups within Syria decide what kind of Syria they want. I mean, it is their country. They have the right to make that decision on their own. They really have not been given the chance to make that decision. And arguing incessantly about whether the rebels are terrorists and whether there should be a transitional regime and what the transitional regime should look like. Right now, it seems to me sabotages the possibility of constitutional talks.
It certainly looks like sabotage. Daniel, do you think the United States now will attack Assad regime and force regime change?
I think the United States will consider a broad range of diplomatic and military options, humanitarian options, and try to decide what will push the situation in a the direction of a political resolution. That's
so
clearly
this
the American
situation
objective.
needs
And
more violence. It needs more war, right?
no, I'm not saying it needs more war. I think war will be one of the options that the president will want to consider. Of course, Moscow has already decided for war, and that's important to understand, and so has Tehran.
That is absolutely laughable. That's absolutely laughable. It is not decided on war. It was the Russian side that pushed the peace talks much harder than the Americans ever did. They grudgingly showed up. Kerry made a complete fool out of himself, and now we're back to square one, except for there's one difference. Thousands and thousands of more Syrians are dead. Christoph, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, we have a very strange situation here. You know, the main culprit of the situation in Syria, that's Washington. They stand with the big gun behind the back, and they say, well, if we can blackmail the parties in Syria into doing what we want, then we will refrain from war. But if they don't do what we want, then we take to war. And that's not a situation. Blackmail under these circumstances is directed against anybody in the world, and the whole world feels pressurized. Let me say one thing about the human rights record made up by the United Nations. The United Nations is a very tarnished organization right now, because in 2008 they made a contract with NATO that NATO is being their armed weapon for the interests of the United Nations, and that's unbelievable. You cannot make a group of countries, you know, the armed force of the United Nations. So the impartiality, which is the most important good of the United Nations, that is tarnished. That's bad. Look back to Syria. If we want to open the way to peace, all the parties interfering have to stop financing and putting weapons in all sides. Of course, also Russia and Iran, but all sides.
Dan, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Simultaneously.
Go ahead, jump in.
Well, Russia and Iran are the principal suppliers to the regime. The regime is much better armed and equipped and financed than the rebels are. I would be glad to see Tehran and Moscow stop their supplies of arms to the
would you agree,
that would be
Daniel,
a real
would
contribution
you agree to
peace.
stop arming the rebels simultaneously? Would you be interested in that kind of negotiation, that kind of diplomacy? Or is it only one-sided all the time?
Without a doubt, there's no question but that the predominance of the violence is by the regime against the Syrian people. That's why a very large percentage of Syrians have already left the country.
Totally.
And that's why Russia will find itself
you have your secret crystal ball. You know who's being killed on a battlefield. It's mostly civilians. We have outside fighters there. It's irrefutable, and they're being funded. Do you think Washington can control Riyadh, not sending any more weapons and jihadists there? Do you think Washington can control Riyadh?
I don't think Washington sends any jihadists there.
I can think so,
and
yes.
to my knowledge,
I didn't say that. I said Saudi Arabia.
The vast
I said Saudi Arabia,
of the weapons supplies
not
are from
Washington. Washington sends money.
You'll have to talk. Washington sends money to what? $1 billion in humanitarian assistance. How much has Russia spent on humanitarian assistance in the last year?
$1 billion. Where is that?
Much?
How did it get into Syria if you can't have a ceasefire? Christoph, go ahead.
Gets in through the UN.
So Washington is sending arms via Turkey to Syria and spending billions on it. And they are even training troops in Jordan. This is all open. Read your own American press. It's in there. It's official. Yeah. So this is one part. The second part is this. We cannot have peace in Syria without the arms flow to rebels. And of course, you know, at a certain stage, when we see the seriousness of those who started this war, this was not started by Syrian people. This was started and organized by CIA agents dislocated in the area in all countries of the Arab belt in the last 2 years before 2011, announced by Condoleezza Rice in 2008. She virtually, you know, she threatened democracy on the area, and the US made up for that. And that's not going to continue, of course. It's not constructive in any way. We have to make sure that this arms flow stops from all sides, jointly.
Richard, jump in here. Do you think that any of the powers involved here, because you seem to be the one that wants to go from civil society up, and that seems like at this point that's the only way to go. But how can you do that if you don't know the groups on the ground? I mean, the people that are doing the fighting don't even want to show up at Geneva or any other venue to talk a ceasefire, at the very least, a ceasefire.
Well, yes. I mean, nobody wants to talk about a ceasefire. Look, a problem is when you're operating purely on the ground of power, and that's all you recognize is power relations, then you're committing yourself to the kind of jockeying and the kind of arguing that we even see on this program, and you're committing yourself to kind of perpetually jockeying on the basis that that what happens in the talks reflects the balance of power. If you think that what happens at the talks reflects the balance of power, then there's no reason actually for either side to talk. The regime is winning the civil war so far, so there's not much reason for them to talk. But the opposition's losing it, so there's not much reason for them to talk because they don't want that ratified in peace talks. And this is why it seems to me you have to be talking about the real issues that divide the Syrian people, and not just purely about these kind of balance of power issues. You know, that's number one. Number two, you know, we're also watching a serious deterioration in U.S.-Russian relations, which is a very bad sign for the world. It's a very bad sign for the peace of the world.
I agree.
And so we need to think about ways that deterioration can be arrested.
Daniel, let me go to Daniel here because we're running out of time here. Daniel, do you think that anything would change if Assad did leave? I mean, why do you focus so much on this one person? Because this is a regime that wants to survive, that's natural and legitimate, actually, by any standard of international law. Why do you focus so much on an individual? Would it be any different if he left?
I don't focus on an individual. I think it's a regime that has to leave because it's lost all credibility with the vast bulk of the Syrian people by violence. It's tried to do to Syria what was done to Chechnya, and it's not working, and it won't work.
Or wait, what you would like to do is you'd like to see the Americans do the same thing that they did to Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Do we need a repeat of that?
No, I don't think.
I don't think we do either.
There's any possibility.
Well, there's a great possibility of more violence if the Obama administration wants to forcefully change this regime, like they've done in the past. Christoph, I'll give you the last word. Go
There's
ahead.
no possibility of American troops on the ground in
Syria,
and that's very clear to everybody in Washington.
Let Christoph the last word.
They have not recovered until now. It's very clear, unless we all agree worldwide that the US and their proxies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, started this war on Syria. That's what it is. And they do this against the Syrian people. And the CIA analyzed that it is the Syrian people in their majority supporting the Assad regime. Please swallow that it's your own American analysis. I believe it. I don't like the CIA. I don't believe the CIA. But this analysis, I believe. I think it's correct. And that means very clearly we have to cover
I wish we had another hour or so because we just got started,
reality.
but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Berlin. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.